Here's why it's important to vote yes on Measure 300. You may or may not know this, but in most of Boulder, it is illegal for more than 3 unrelated people to live together. It's illegal no matter how big the house is, how old the residents are, or even if the owner lives in the home. The dark blue area of this map shows where the occupancy limit is 3 unrelated people. The law yields many negative results, so let's name a few. Liberty and justice for all. We believe that all people should have equal access to housing regardless of the relationship between the residents. Affordability. Sharing housing is a critical strategy that lower-income families and individuals use to afford housing in Boulder today. Property rights. The current law restricts people's freedom to choose who they can live with in their own private residence. Housing security. The current occupancy law forces people to live in vulnerable housing situations with the risk of eviction being just one phone call away. And fair housing laws. The Fair Housing Act recommends allowing 2 people per bedroom to prevent discrimination. Community engagement. When people live over-occupied, they are less likely to engage civically, connect with their elected officials, register to vote, or even talk to their neighbors because they're afraid of getting evicted. The effect is to silence people who are not rich enough or who prefer to live with their chosen family. And environment. Sharing housing uses less energy per person and allows people to live closer to where they work, both of which help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, contributing to our climate crisis. It's easy to focus on the policies, but what is infinitely more important is how these policies are impacting people. There are countless heart-wrenching stories that we could share about how this law has hurt people, but we received this note recently from a Boulder resident, Kristen W., and would like to share it. Quote, I am now disabled. After being married for 20 years and raising 3 children, I am in a situation where I will need to have housemates in my senior years. It is for financial reasons and for companionship. I don't wish to be segregated, but that seems to be happening anyway due to my disability. Please make Boulder and everywhere else a better place. People should be able to choose whom they live with. Family is not always blood related. End quote. So as a community, we have the choice to make life a little easier for Kristen and for thousands of others. That is why we are putting forward a solution that will overturn the discriminatory and restrictive occupancy law that has been in place for far too many decades. We believe a simple, common sense change would be to set occupancy limits for unrelated people based on the number of bedrooms in a home. In 2020, we proposed a charter amendment which could only have been amended by another vote of the people. We heard from members of the community that they would like more flexibility to make changes if needed. We took that feedback into consideration and we decided to run our measure as a municipal initiative in 2021. And the difference is that it gives council members and the community the ability to amend our measure if needed in the future. So as noted in the charter section here, a 2/3 majority on council would be able to amend the legislation, quote, provided that the amendments do not alter or modify the basic intent, close quote. Council has immense power to regulate other areas related to occupancy, in particular with building codes, transportation management, enforcement, and the implementation of rental licensing, all of which can be changed with a simple majority of council members. Now, you may have heard from our opponents that expanding access to housing will make Boulder more expensive, but research published by President Biden and the White House would disagree with that position. The White House released an article on exclusionary zoning stating that, quote, the empirical literature finds a relationship between restrictive land use regulations and higher housing prices, and that anti-density zoning increases Black residential segregation in U.S. metropolitan areas by reducing the quantity of affordable housing in white jurisdictions. People across the country have begun to recognize the negative impacts of occupancy limits and the urgent need for change. In the last year, Oregon and Washington joined several other states like California in making home occupancy laws like Boulder's illegal. Research from Sightline Institute shows that, quote, cities have historically excluded low-income renters through capping the number of unrelated people that can live together in a home. In Boulder, we just simply have not been doing enough to address our housing crisis. 60% of renters in the City of Boulder are paying more than 30% of their income in rent. Boulder's detached homes reach a median price of $1.5 million, which is up 56% from the past year. Our opponents want to uphold policies that have only made Boulder more expensive.
For decades, city staff and working groups have identified and recommended reforming occupancy limits as one tool to address Boulder's housing crisis. Some examples of reported recommendations include the 1999 Toolkit for Housing Options, the 2011 Affordable Housing Task Force, and as part of the 2014 Comprehensive Housing Strategy. Despite these recommendations, city councils took no action on the issue. In 2014, city staff and community members recommended relaxing occupancy limits for senior citizens, and the city council rejected that proposal. In 2015, city council was strongly considering increasing enforcement and evictions for overoccupancy. In response, nearly 100 speakers urged council to not increase enforcement and instead make it easier for people to live together, to share costs, and create community. This was the beginning of the Bedrooms Are for People movement. A small group of people made plans to put a measure on the 2016 ballot to increase occupancy limits in Boulder, but did not have enough resources to get the measure on the ballot that year. Then in 2019, key people from the 2016 effort gathered to put this measure on the ballot in 2020. The Bedrooms Are for People campaign collected over 5,200 valid signatures and showed significant community support. Rather than honoring the 2020 election guidelines the city staff provided, City Council deliberately changed their interpretation of Boulder's election laws to prevent our measure from being placed on the ballot. So we sued the city for ballot access. While a district court judge agreed that the city made numerous errors, he felt he did not have the power to place our measure on the ballot. We organized a march of over 100 people through Central Boulder to lobby the City Council to reform Boulder's occupancy limits, or at least stop evicting people in the midst of an economic and public health crisis. After Governor Jared Polis explicitly asked Boulder City Council to stop enforcing occupancy limits due to the COVID-19 pandemic and eviction crisis, Council decided to delay that decision on reforming occupancy limits until their council retreat. At that retreat, 5 council members again refused to take any action on addressing occupancy limits. This is why we felt the need to run our measure again in 2021. Recently, Mayor Sam Weaver responded to a recommendation to take up the issue of occupancy. His response was, quote, "The issue of occupancy limits is a political question, and I personally feel the place to settle political questions is at the ballot box." As it turns out, he may have been right about this. We have experienced an outpouring of support for our measure across the city. Here's a map showing all of our petition signers by resident address. It turns out the support we felt while standing in front of grocery stores was not just anecdotal. Former council member Jan Burton commissioned Drake Research to conduct a statistically valid survey on community issues, including the Bedrooms Are for People ballot measure. In Bob Drake's report on key findings, he wrote, "Against the background of how voters feel about housing in the city, the folks backing the Bedrooms Are for People initiative have really hit a nerve with their desire to change the occupancy limits in the city. A substantial 75% of voters say they support this proposal, while 71% are indicating strong support. Just 16% are opposed," end quote. We've received endorsements from every area of Boulder, from housing groups to LGBTQ advocates to the Boulder Chamber, to labor unions, to environmental groups. We want to read a bit from their endorsement statements. From EFA, quote, "We feel this initiative aligns with EFA's support for housing stability and prevention of family homelessness. In fact, the most common thing for families to do when they lose housing is to double up with another family, which is often illegal under Boulder's current laws. Loosening these limits is key to preventing family homelessness." From the Sierra Club, Boulder already has nearly 60,000 in-commuters a day, and the city's strict occupancy limits add more cars to the road as people are forced to live out of town. Vehicles mile traveled goes up, carbon in the atmosphere increases, and our mental health becomes worse with the smog. Even more troubling is the fact that often the most vulnerable among us are forced out of town. The carbon footprint of a home is significant. Whether 3 people or 5 people live in a space, the space itself uses a tremendous amount of energy, embodied and operational. The simple truth is, the more people who live in a space, the more efficient that space is per person. Climate change and our affordable housing crisis are arguably the two most important issues we must deal with now. The Sierra Club supports Bedrooms Are for People because it furthers Sierra Club's stated goals on both climate change and affordable housing. From Will Tour, who raised his family in Boulder and is now the executive director of the Colorado Energy Office, quote, Boulder's current occupancy limits essentially make it illegal to be poor in Boulder. From the time I moved here at age 18 in 1980 until 1993, I was in violation of this ordinance the entire time I lived in Boulder, as were my friends. None of us had the money to live here without sharing a home. I went on to become mayor and county commissioner, but I have never forgotten what it was like to have to live in fear that we would be evicted simply for the crime of not being wealthy enough.
3 of the 4 members who will be on council through 2023 support our measure, as do 4 council candidates. These individuals have co-signed this statement, quote, Boulder's restrictive occupancy limits cause harm to many people in our community. Bedrooms Are for People brings greatly needed change to our city's housing laws. Since several city councils have chosen not to address the issue, we fully support this measure and will work to ensure that the whole community benefits from its passage. We believe that all people deserve equal protection under the law. Fair housing laws are not the source of Boulder's affordable housing problem, and we can't discriminate our way to inclusion or affordability. We are in a climate crisis, and our laws should not prohibit people from living more sustainably. We believe that Boulder voters are ready to expand access to housing at the ballot box this year. When our elected representatives don't have the political will to do what's right, progress must be led by the people. We need your vote to make this positive change for our community. Please vote yes on Measure 300. Bedrooms Are for People.